Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite-Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite-Size Balance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bite-Size Balance. This is going to be a really great conversation. I have the pleasure today to have with me Amanda Lee, who goes by the name, as an author, goes by the name A.E. Lee. And Amanda is a domestic abuse survivor and the author of the new book, One of the Lucky Ones. Amanda started her career in Pennsylvania politics, and while she had hoped it would be exactly like the West Wing, it was not. Long hours, low pay, and even less respect convinced her to make a change and embark on a second career in education. Now, Amanda's a sixth grade teacher and lives with her two children in Fairfax County, Virginia, where she pursues her passion for writing and advocating for fellow victims of domestic abuse. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence in the United States, 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. This extraordinarily common form of abuse silences victims and paralyzes them with terror. It's a pattern Amanda is all too familiar with. Like so many women in the US and Canada and abroad, her fairy tale romance turned increasingly turbulent and violent. And like so many, she felt at times that her future looked bleak. But it wasn't, and through courage, she found freedom. So Amanda is with us today to share her story, and I am so excited to have this conversation with her. Hi, Amanda. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you here. I was just saying to Amanda before we hit record that I read her book this morning, and she has done such a great job of telling her story. I'm so pleased that you are here today to tell us in person, because I think this is such an important topic, and it's not one that we've talked about on the podcast before. So really quick, before we get going, we're going to be talking about domestic abuse. We're going to be talking about emotional abuse and also physical abuse. And so I just want to let listeners know that if this is an area that you feel like might be triggering for you, or if you have kids in the car, or if for any other reason this is not the episode for you, I just want to let you know upfront that's what we're talking about. So, but I do think this is a really important thing for us to be talking about. And I was so glad when Amanda reached out about coming on the podcast, because I think this is an important topic. And we, as I said, haven't talked about it yet. So Amanda, do you want to just start? I know it's probably so hard, but do you want to just start by trying to, condense your story for us and just let people know why it is that you're here today to talk about domestic abuse and what your own personal experience with this is and kind of where that's led you?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for having me on. I will do the Cliff Notes version, as I call it. So I met my ex-husband about 10 or so years ago. We were married, no, longer than that, 12 years ago. We were married for 7. We were together for 10. And I was at a place, I was 28. And I was at a place in my life where I was ready to get married. And I think, particularly as women, we all feel it at some point, especially if that's a desire of yours. I had been a bridesmaid 10 times. I now had friends having babies, and I was just like, all right, enough already. I want it to be my turn. And my ex-husband kind of felt the same way. We both were in those moments of searching for someone to marry. And it was right place, right time. We met at a party and we clicked. He was charming. He knew everything. And it worked. And, looking back and hindsight is such a beautiful thing, because, we now know that the relationship was going to got abusive. It wasn't overnight. And I think that's the part that people don't understand, is that abuse doesn't happen. It's not like everything is rainbows and sunshine, and then the next day he's beating me. That's not how abuse works. It's a slow trickle. It's first questioning, well, oh yeah, maybe he's right. Maybe I do that. And then it's the slow belittling. And then it builds, it chips away at your self-esteem to the point where you feel you're trapped. And I did feel that. And that trapped moment didn't happen until I had a ring on my finger. We had gotten engaged a year and a half out after we first started dating. And I had finally, it was my moment. I was not going to be 27 dresses anymore. It was going to be my moment. And I had my grandmother's engagement ring on my finger that I had wanted since I was as long as I can remember. And I felt trapped. I think subconsciously, I knew what was happening was abuse, but I couldn't come to terms with it.
Sorry, just to interrupt. At that point in time when you got engaged, what was happening? What did it look? What did the relationship?
It was verbal. It was
Mm-hmm.
verbal abuse. It was belittling. It was, before we got on, we were discussing the term gaslighting
Mm-hmm.
and how it's thrown about all the time now. Back in the day, no one knew what gaslighting was, but the definition of it is questioning your own reality, questioning your self-worth, questioning oh, maybe I do that. And that was more of what was happening. He would tell me that he had told me things and I had no recollection, to the point where I was like, maybe I need to go get a MRI or go see a neurologist. Maybe there's something wrong with my brain. It was, slowly chipping away at my self-esteem. I was convinced that I was an awful driver. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not the best driver in the history of the world. I'm really not. But I'm also not, you're not taking your life in your hands when you get in my car. It's, questioning what I'm going to wear, how I'm going to do my hair. It's that slow chipping away of your self-esteem. That is what was happening right when we got engaged. And then the physical abuse started right after we got engaged. And that was when I really felt that I was trapped. And it was almost the first sign of physical abuse, the first physical abuse incident, was almost like an out-of-body experience. Mm-hmm. It was like after it had happened, and it was pretty severe. He had thrown a glass of wine at me and then headbutted me till I fell on the back of our bed in our apartment at the time. And I picked up the dry cleaning that day. And I remember this distinctly because I was in a sea of plastic with his hands on my neck. And I thought, this is it. This is it. This is how I'm going to die. And he got off of me. I don't know what made him get off of me. And he left the apartment. And I remember it was a shock. It was, what just happened? How did this just happen? And then it was almost like a shame spiral. I'm from Philly. I don't take anyone's crap. These things, this is not going to happen to me. And I'm an intelligent woman. No, I'm not an abusive. No, this has to be an isolated incident. And when he did come back, it was apologizing. It was, we'll go to couples therapy. We'll do all this. We'll do all that. And I thought, okay, all right. Obviously this was isolated. This is never going to happen again. And then unfortunately it did. And, we got married. I had the wedding of my dreams and we had children very quickly. Within a year, I was pregnant. And when my son was 9 months old, I was pregnant again. And, having a baby doesn't make a fragile relationship better. It adds stress. And I thought that when I was pregnant for the first time with our son, I thought maybe having a child would help change his temperament a little bit. I knew it was going to be stressful. I knew it was going to be the hardest thing I ever did, but I thought maybe seeing the world through a child's eyes would stop the abuse. And unfortunately, it just escalated it. And the verbal abuse continued and the physical abuse continued. And I was in a sea of trying to raise two small children, working full time, and just trying to survive, to the point where one day, I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. I remember distinctly looking in my bathroom mirror being like, who is this person? This is not the person that I know. This is not myself. And I don't know what shook me, but 4 years ago around this time, I was just like, enough. I woke up. I was like, this is abuse and I need to get out. And then it became How do I get out quick? How do I get out safely? And also, if I'm not there, how am I going to protect my children? I was very aware that because I had never called the police, that it would be my word against his, and he probably would get 50-50 custody.
Right.
So how would I protect my children if I wasn't physically there every day? And then about 5 months later, my hand was forced. We had an argument one August evening, and it escalated to the point where he threatened to kill me. And then he had threatened to burn the house down with myself and the children in it, and went as far as got a gas can and a lighter. And I ran upstairs as fast as I could, and I pulled my then 5 and 3-year-old out of bed, and we sprinted for our lives to our neighbor's house. And then the police were involved in protective orders, and it was a horrific event. It was traumatic. It breaks my heart every day that is part of my children's story. But it's also one of my life's blessings, because I was able to get out. At that moment, the choice was no longer mine. I had to get out to save my children. And while he maintains that event never actually happened, myself and my children know that it did, because we heard it and we saw it. And had that event not happened, I would never have gotten a protective order. And I would like to think that I would have left by now, but I don't know. It forced me to get the law involved. It forced me to make those really difficult conversations. I had not told anyone what was going on, and part of that was shame. I couldn't believe that I was allowing this to happen to me. And that's part of the mindset of the victim. Like, you got to shift that mindset. I wasn't allowing this to happen to me. It was happening to me. And I'm not the one who needed to feel shame. He was. But that took years for me to even utter that sentence. And I had to call my parents. I had to call my sister. I had to tell my big brother. I had to tell my best friends. And those calls were really hard. But I knew, because the police were involved, that there was no turning back. And I'm so thankful that I had that moment, because that was my turning point. That was the climax for me. And that is what started me on the journey of being able to switch from being a victim to a survivor.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That gas can scene was just wild when I read that part. And so many other of the instances that you describe in the book were just heart-wrenching to me. Well, they all were, but there were some that were just so awful. And I know that, one of the things as I was reading your story, I was thinking, was, first of all, I was thinking about how great it was that you had the neighbor that you had. So the neighbor, what was his name? Joe? Jack. So the neighbor who happened to be a police officer who was able to assist you and give you some shelter, basically, in the like those first minutes after that gas can situation, and then other situations, I think, as well, and just give you some guidance and support through that, which is something that most people, I mean, that was just like so serendipitous that he was your neighbor, right? And that seemed to me like what a blessing that was for you to have that person so close by, and then somebody to guide you, because so many women, and the majority of women who find themselves in this situation, would not have anyone that they could trust within the legal system, is my guess. So there's that. And then just the complicated nature of this for you in terms of when to report, and all of the different considerations that were going through your mind around whether you should report. Because there were many times before the gas can incident where you thought to yourself, or somebody advised you to report, right?
Yeah.
And so what are some of the things that you're thinking about in those moments when you have kids? Because a lot of them were connected to the fact that there were children involved.
Yeah. I mean, the answer is like tenfold.
Yeah.
Part of it was, I don't think I was ready to make that step. The other part was I was a victim of domestic violence for 10 years. So I believed him when he told me I couldn't survive without him. I couldn't financially survive without him. No one was going to want me, like I'm awful. And I believed that. I live in Northern Virginia, in one of the most wealthy suburbs in the country. And I was like, how am I going to survive on I'm a teacher, a teacher salary here with two small children. And my entire family is in a different state. And Philadelphia is not that far from DC, but it's about 3 hours, unless, there's a fiery crash on 95, then everything gets shut down and, you're put for 8 hours. But I didn't know how I was going to survive. My fear, and reporting it before, was how am I going to do this on my own?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's another reason, like, I'm thankful that night in August happened. I didn't have time to think about the what ifs. It was, I need to act now and deal with whatever happens later. Like I didn't have time to run through all those scenarios. Well, what happens if I call? What are they going to do? Are they going to press charges? Are we going to get a divorce? How am I going to afford to divorce him? How am I going to afford to live without him? What happens to the house? I didn't have time to do all the what ifs. It was grab the kids and run. He's going to burn the house down.
Right. Right. Yeah. No, I got such a clear sense of how complicated all of this is. It was in your head and is in other women's heads as they're trying to survive through this. It's just so many different things going on. And I wondered, so it was really interesting to me what happened when you did leave and they did press charges, because you didn't really have control over that. They just said, you don't have a choice. We're pressing charges, correct?
Yeah. So earlier in the argument that night, he had thrown water on me. So I was soaked when the police showed up. And apparently, and I learned that that night, that when you throw any type of liquid on anyone, that's considered assault.
Right.
So they saw physical signs of assault. So they said the state is pressing charges. At this point, it doesn't matter. You could tell us you don't want to press charges. We're pressing charges.
Right.
And they also pressed charges for him. I forget the exact, I think it was like it's bomb and burn. It was like mixed together. So they pressed charges. They gave me an emergency protective order, which was good for like 48 or 72 hours. And I had to go that Monday to get an extension, a 2-week extension. We ended up in court for the criminal charges, where he only got a slap on the wrist.
Right. That's the part I wanted to talk about, because it didn't really blow my mind. I mean, I have a background in law and also spend a lot of time. I'm just genuinely interested and outraged in terms of the state of the law and the inherent bias against women.
Yeah.
And so when I read that, it wasn't I wasn't shocked, but at the same time I was shocked. I was like, what? You just told your story in about 5 minutes. And I'm telling everybody who's listening, if you read Amanda's book, this is a continuous pattern of incredible emotional abuse, verbal abuse, and physical abuse over a long period of time. And not just with you, also with your kids. So the verbal abuse with your kids was heartbreaking. To me.
And that was really when I was like, they cannot live in an environment like this. I need to get out. Started towards them. But when we went to court, I never thought that they wouldn't believe me. I'm like, I'm the victim. Like, why? Like, it never even crossed my mind that someone wouldn't believe me. Why would I make something like this up? Like, I've got an active imagination, but it is not that active. It never crossed my mind. And as he started telling his version of what happened, and I started telling my version of what happened, I started to see that there were people that weren't believing me. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. He's telling a different version and they were his friends first, or it's his family. Like, I get it. And I remember sitting there with the district attorney, and he told me that because I had never called before and I had never pressed charges before, that he does not have a record. So he was going to get probation for 2 years.
Right.
And I remember sitting there in disbelief. I'm like, what are you talking about? The man threatened to burn my house down with me and my children. Those were his words. He told me he was going to burn the house down before the cops even got a chance to ring the doorbell.
Yeah.
And he was like, well, it's his word against yours. And then I tried to hold it in, but I ended up yelling at him. I was like, this is why domestic violence victims don't come forward.
Right.
Because by the time we've made a call, that is the straw that's broken the camel's back. There are hundreds of other incidents behind that caused us to make that first call. No, very few domestic violent victims call the very first time.
Right. Yeah.
So by the time they make that call, there is a series of events, years of events behind them.
Yeah.
And they were like, it's his word against yours. I'm like, all right, great. Thanks.
Yeah, it immediately made me think of a book you probably haven't read because it's written by a Canadian author. There's a book called Run Towards the Danger by Sarah Polley, who's a Canadian actress and film director. And
oh yeah, I've heard of her before.
Yeah, it's a really great book. But one of the things she talks about is it's not domestic abuse. She's talking about the bias against women in the legal system around sexual assault. And, it's she does a very good job, I think, of describing it, and just this not the exact issue, but similar issue, in terms of why women don't come forward, and how hard it is to tell your story, and how it feels to not be believed, and the repercussions of all of it. So the first, I'm going to call it the first time with the charges were pressed was when when you left. It was and that led to him being on probation for a period of time. And then what was the situation with the kids? Was he able to see the kids?
We had a 2-year protective order, and then it got renewed for another year. And that was another instance in the courtroom where I felt as the victim completely disregarded. So the judge ordered for him to do supervised visits. He was under psychiatric care. It turns out during the psychiatric care that he received right after everything happened, that he was diagnosed with bipolar. I forget which, I know there's different versions of bipolar. I forget which one it is. So he was under the care of a psychiatrist, psychologist, anger management, parenting coach. I mean, he got it all, which is great because, and we can get into it later, now he is a functioning co-parent, but in the beginning he wasn't. So he was awarded supervised visits every Monday. And then the judge said that he needed to have FaceTime calls with the kids every other day.
Yes. And your description of why, I was like, oh, I totally feel you when you said like, that seemed like a good idea, but then
and I'm like,
the reality of that, if anyone's ever had little kids on a FaceTime call, and I was just thinking back to when my kids were little, and you sit still and you're like telling them to say things because nobody's talking, and it's
I am constantly comparing it to like the movie back in the 90s, the Blair Witch Project, where they have the camera and they're just running. I mean, that is FaceTiming with a small child. And the other part is, which I did not think about, not that I don't think it would have mattered if I spoke up, but I had to hear his voice every other night.
Yeah.
And they're small kids. So I could sit in the other room because I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear what they were talking about, but they'd want to sit next to me while they were talking to him, or they want me in the room. And it's just, it was awful.
Yeah. So hard. Oh my gosh. So then there's this period of time where he is on probation, and you at some point start another relationship. And then there's this just bonkers situation with the stalking and do you want to just talk a little bit about that? Because that, that is, I mean, he did finally get, there was some repercussions for him, at least with this piece of it, but it was years later. Like,
I mean, so something that I was not aware of, and I'm sure a lot of people aren't as well, is that, and when you think about it, you're like, oh, that makes sense. The most dangerous time for a domestic violence victim is right when you leave, because that's when the abuser realizes that they don't have any control over you. And what I did not realize right away, but apparently was happening almost immediately, I live in a small cul-de-sac. There's 7 houses. My neighbor 2 doors down, could not believe, I think their exact quote to my other neighbor was, they couldn't believe that I would split up my family. They couldn't believe I would call the police on my husband.
Right.
So there was some sort of communication between them, and they either offered or he convinced them to give him access to their camera in their son's room that points to my driveway. And the only reason I knew that this was happening is because I did start another relationship several months after, and he was extremely upset about it. And he would text me, I can't believe you let him park in the garage. And this was in 30 seconds of it happening.
Right.
We walked in the front door one time and 10 seconds, we hadn't even shut the front door. I cannot believe you let him come over.
Right.
There was an incident where my daughter, they decided her and her little girlfriends were picking dandelions and were delivering them to every house. And he was like, I can't believe she doesn't have a coat on. Do you know how cold it is?
Right. So you knew he was watching.
I knew he was watching. I had no idea how it was.
Yeah.
I had the house swept like 3 times by a private investigator. I called the police. I got nothing. They told me, I said, I'm pretty sure it's this neighbor. I'm pretty sure it's that window because there's a camera and it's pointing right at my driveway. And they were like, we can't do anything about it.
That was mind blowing to me. I can't even imagine how terrifying it is to be you in that situation and have this very confident feeling that you're being watched all the time. Mm-hmm. And by this person who has shown himself to be incredibly dangerous and violent.
Yeah.
And then have the police, have that be the response of the police. And I don't understand the law around all of that. So I'm not.
Neither do I.
That, but I mean, it just struck me as so not okay that was the response of the police in that situation. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about, and I don't know if this is the case in Canada, we have lots of listeners in the US and all over the world. But the fact that your neighbor who was the police officer told you, so he was there at some point when the texts were coming in, I think maybe you had gone over, and then he gave you some advice as to what to text back. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. He was, I mean, we are very, my family and their family, we're very close. We go on vacations together. We have holidays together. So it was one day we were sitting together on their couch and I was getting texts. I think it was the day I was getting texts about my daughter's coat situation outside. And he told me, he said, you need to say, stop stalking me. Like, we need to build a case that he's stalking you. You need to say this verbiage because you need to prove that he's stalking you. And then you can charge him for stalking.
Right.
And then it started to get out of hand with commenting on my coming and going when I would have a babysitter. I mean, I was a new single mom with 2 small children and worked full time. I would get a babysitter so I could go to the grocery store.
Right. So
I could go get a haircut, normal things. To him, it was because I was going to see my new boyfriend. It wasn't. Most of the time it was, I'm just trying to do some normal things without having to take a 5 and 4-year-old with me. And when I called the police, I had just had the house swept and I was terrified, and I got a female officer and I thought in my mind, score,
right.
Sisterhood. And she was like, there's nothing I can do. I'm like, what do you mean? Well, I mean, it's on their property. They can have a camera pointed anywhere they want. And I was like, I was so blown away. And then it continued to get worse. I called again. An officer called me back and he told me, I will never forget this. He told me, look, you might be in a dangerous situation. You should have a safe word. And I remember being like, what do you mean a safe word? He's like, well, if you feel in danger, you can call one of your friends or text the safe word and they know to call 911. And I just remember going, buddy, listen, like if I'm in a dangerous situation and I have time to call a friend and say a safe word, I'm going to call 911. That's probably a better situation for me.
Yeah. But also if you think I'm in a dangerous situation where
could you do something?
Could you do something? Like, is there nothing that you can do here? That's the part that just...
So, I mean, we did go back to court quite a few times to add things to the protective order. Like you can't do surveillance on me. I don't know. I mean, it stopped at this point, but like, as we were going through, I don't know if it stopped. Right. I really don't. I mean, I just kind of always assumed for a year and a half that every time I stepped outside my door, I was being watched.
Gosh.
And then you go through like, my kids were just through this traumatic event. They're small. They need consistency. I'm trying to keep everything as consistent as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, do I up and move and just move to a temporary like townhouse, or do I try and stick it out because this is their home base? This is where they feel safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all of that. I think it's just mind blowing when you hear it. Like objectively, it's mind blowing that this can happen. So one of the things that really struck me was at the very beginning of the book when you talked about, and I'm probably not going to get it exactly right, so please correct me, but at the very beginning, you talk about the first time that he was abusive with you, and you called his mom. And I can't remember whether there was physical abuse in this situation, but it was heinous, whatever it was awful. Mm-hmm. And you called his mom because you had a friendship with her and told her what had happened. And she said something like, you should pack a bag and have it ready so that you can leave. I do.
Yep.
and as soon as I read those words, I thought, wow. And then for the rest of the book, I was sort of waiting to hear about why she has a bag packed, and it never really came out. And then at the end, you said, you had your suspicions, but it doesn't sound like it was something that you ever had conversations with her about in terms of his father and how how his father behaved in that marriage. Mm-hmm. And it just got me thinking about this whole cycle of domestic abuse. And I know that, one of the things that you had a psychic, which I also thought was cool, by the way, because I have a thing for good psychics. But
she's wonderful. I'll give you her name and number. Like, she's great. I totally recommend her.
So one of the things that she had said to you was, leaving is going to be the best thing that you can do for yourself and for your kids, especially your son. And I thought that was really interesting because I just wondered, and you may know statistically, I don't know the numbers, but what the chances are of a boy repeating that pattern, of a child repeating the pattern. I mean, not a boy, but a child repeating the pattern of domestic abuse in their home. And, I don't know do you know anything around that?
I don't know statistics, other than we mimic what we see,
of
right?
Course.
Especially as kids. And I just remember thinking, and I used to say this to him, especially about our daughter, like, how would you feel if you heard someone say that to our daughter's name's Tessa, to Tessa, and he would fire back like, well, if she was acting like you. And I'm like, okay. And then I think, like, I don't want Ethan thinking that this is a normal way you treat your partner. I don't want either of them thinking this is a normal way. Mm-hmm. In terms of his mom, I mean, I witnessed some of their arguments, and there was name calling. There was anger. It's well known in the family that his father had anger. I have my suspicions that it has been verbal and physical, but I don't know that for a fact. Mm-hmm. What I do know is that it became she was first my ally. That mm-hmm. first incident of physical abuse, which was what I talked about previously when I was thrown on the bed, she was my ally. And in fact, she told me in that moment when I called her, I spoke to her the next day. She told me, if you ever call me and tell me that again, I don't care that he's my son, I'm calling the police.
Right. It's so interesting because
fast forward.
Yeah, exactly.
And fast forward to when everything happened, she accused me of throwing her son out with the trash. Mm-hmm. According to them, I'm the devil for doing this. I have it all. I got the house and I have the kids, and he is a broken man because of me. I did this to him.
Yeah. What have you learned through this whole, because not only have you lived through this, obviously yourself, but you are involved now and passionate about advocating for domestic abuse mm-hmm. survivors and for women who are in relationships that are abusive. And, what did you learn through this whole process and since then that you would, if there's someone listening who's thinking, I get it, I am there, I'm stuck in it, I don't know how to get out, I don't know what to do. What would you say to that woman?
I think validating first that you recognize it. I think recognizing what's happening is like it's obviously the first step, but it's the biggest step.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I wish I knew now. I wish I knew then what I know now, is what I'm trying to say. You know, because getting out, I am in a much better financial place than I was when I was married to him, because I was paying for everything. And now I have child support. He has to pay for our kids. I am in an actual healthy partnership that does exist. I used to think when people would talk about having a teammate and a partner and someone who is your best friend, I'd be like, okay, that's cute, but like, that doesn't like exist really. And it does exist. And the quote that stands out to me, to anyone who's going through this, is that I have never met, and once you become a survivor, people come out of the woodwork,
Right.
like that you didn't even know. It's like, oh, that happened to me. Oh, that happened to me. But I have never met a survivor of domestic violence who regrets leaving.
Right.
I've never read about it, met someone, watched a even the TV shows. I have never met anyone who's regretted leaving.
Yes. And probably most of the people you talk to regret staying as long as they did. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it is so complicated. And after reading your book, and just gave me a better understanding of the complicated, as I said, all of the factors that are going on in your head, but also just the repercussions and the legal system and all of that stuff. And it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing. Yeah. How it all works out.
And it's like when people ask, why didn't you leave? Why did you stay? And I just kind of blankly look at them like, I mean, I don't know. Do you want like the hour version answer? Because it's not just a one sentence answer. It's a multitude of things that are going in your world.
Right. Right. Because he was very, he was very remorseful and contrite when he come back. Right. And lots of promises about doing the work and therapy and all of these things were happening. Yeah. What about somebody who, because there will be probably some people listening to this podcast, unfortunately, who are in that situation and who are feeling afraid and who do want to get out, but there will be a lot of people listening who aren't, but who know somebody who is. And so I wonder what you would say to those people in terms of like, what was the type of support you received that was helpful from people in your life who cared about you, and how can we support somebody?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, and people need to understand, when you are going through this, and even after, there is so much shame associated with it. Shame, part of like the abuse cycle, is believing that you're allowing this to happen to you. And that's not accurate. You're not allowing anything to happen to you. It's happening to you. Doesn't matter what you do, the person's going to be abusive. It has nothing to do with your actions. It has everything to do with theirs. So any type of support or anything you're doing for a loved one who might be going through this, you have to understand that there is shame associated with it. So trying to have deep conversations about why they're staying and why they're leaving is probably not the most helpful thing. One of the most helpful things to me when everything was happening was friends going, what do you need?
Right.
What do you need right now? And a lot of times I was like, oh, I don't even know. I kind of need a drink and a nap, but I need to feed my kids. And it was, one of my best friends. Okay, cool. I'll be over in a minute. She came over, she sent me upstairs to take a nap, fed our kids dino nuggets, watched a movie. They were doing crafts. It was so needed. Or it's the friends who happen to be making a run to Krispy Kreme donuts because they have the special Halloween donuts, donut shop in the US. I don't know if you have it in Canada. And, just show up unannounced. Hey, Saturday morning, we brought you guys donuts. Thought it'd be a fun treat. It's those types of little things that add up. Do the little things. If they don't know what they need, think about what you would need. What would you want in that situation?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great way to look at it. Can we go back for a second to the types of abuse? Because I really, I think we all know what physical abuse looks like, but emotional and verbal abuse is a gray area, I think, for a lot of people. And I want to talk a little bit about what that looked like for you, and how you know whether what's happening is okay or not, if that's going on in your relationship. Because as we were talking before we hit record, I was saying, I don't know the statistics, and you were saying, yeah, we'll probably never have them, but the statistics on the percentage of relationships where emotional and verbal abuse is happening, but maybe there isn't the physical abuse. But I suspect it's a lot higher than the physical abuse. And so like, what are we talking about? What kinds of things constitute that emotional abuse?
Well, I think just to step back, anytime you have a partner that's belittling you, that's abuse. That is not okay. You should not have a partner that is putting you down in any way or making you feel, less than what you are. When we talk about verbal abuse, it's, the obvious, it's the name calling. It's the anger associated with the words, with the name calling. It's the slow, and this goes into the emotional verbal abuse. It's the slow chip away of your self-esteem. It's, and it's not all at once. It'll, like I said, it'll be telling you like, oh, I told you this. I told you, oh, I'm concerned about your memory. Why aren't you remembering this? And it's like, oh my gosh, do I need to go see a neurologist? It's, constantly, putting down the way you have your hair. I don't, have you tried your hair lighter? Maybe you need to do lighter. And then it's, then it builds and builds and builds to where you're like, oh, well, I need him to come with me to the hairdresser so he can tell my hairdresser what color my hair should be.
Right. Yeah. And one scene really stuck out to me. And that was where, I don't know if it was after your first or your second child, but you're just overwhelmed. Like I think it was your second child, because you were also physically in pain because you had your kids close together and you hadn't quite healed from the first, it sounded like, from the first delivery. And he said to you something like, you're an awful mother. All of your friends who have kids have got it together. Why are you such a mess? Or something along those lines. And I just thought, it was like, it literally brought tears to my eyes. I just thought, I can't even imagine. Like I was barely keeping my shit together when my kids were little. And if someone had said to me, you're an awful mother, let alone someone who was supposed to be like my biggest kind of supporter and fan, it would have just been so devastating to me.
Yeah. I could tell you exactly where I was. I was in the back seat of his car. My son was just 4 months old, wasn't pregnant with the second one yet. And we had just come back. We were on our way back from visiting my parents, and my son, and I love him. He's a great little boy, but he had like every childhood disease known to man. The kid was colicky. He wouldn't sleep. He had acid reflux. He constantly had ear infections. He was a very challenging, newborns are challenging, but he was a challenging newborn. And I was barely sleeping. I had just gone back to work. I was trying to do it all. And he told me that I was an awful mother. Couldn't understand why I wasn't more like my one friend who had 3 children. And she had a baby 2 weeks before I did. Couldn't understand why I didn't get it together. Why couldn't I be more like her? She's not as big of a mess as I am. Thought it was ridiculous that I had, I told him one day, I'm like, I think I have postpartum anxiety. I had been reading about it. I'm like, I feel like he told me I was ridiculous. You don't have that. Why would you think you have that? You don't have that. Told me I was just stupid.
Right. Yeah. Which is questioning your reality, which is gaslighting, which is like, I wanted to talk about it for a bit because I feel like a lot of this stuff, we just sweep under the rug. It happens. I have been in relationships before where things have been said to me that I would never have classified as abusive, but I can see now the benefit of like hindsight, but also maturity and experience, right? I look back and I'm like, boy, that was not okay. That was said to me.
I think that moment when he said that, I knew in the back of my head, I knew I was doing everything I possibly could. And there is not a mother around or a father that thinks they are rocking it in parenthood.
No.
Like if you think you're doing an amazing job, then you're doing something wrong. We all think we're failing. I mean, getting my kids out the door this morning, I was just like, oh gosh, so I knew in the back of my head, I was doing everything I could. And I think I chalked it up to Don's just angry again. He's angry. He doesn't mean it. That's how I used to he doesn't mean it. He says it, but he doesn't mean it. And, at some point you've got to take their words for truth. If they're speaking it, they mean it.
Yeah.
You say they're saying it, but they don't mean it. You're making excuses for them. And I constantly did that. I constantly made excuses for the things that he did.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing some of those examples. I think that's helpful to people. Just to have a better understanding of it's not just with a lot of these things, if you just took the one thing out of context, it wouldn't seem like that big of a deal, but this repeated pattern of just constant criticism and the belittling, as you say, would just eat away completely at your confidence, which then of course makes it harder for you to leave.
Yeah.
Because it feels like you don't even know your own self anymore.
Yeah.
And you're making all of these things up and this isn't as bad as it should be. And then combined with that shame, I'm sure just makes it even more challenging to take.
And it's a cycle. It's not an everyday. This abuse is not happening every day. So when you're having the good days, you're like, okay, maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I was thinking that when I was reading the book, because the book, of course, is a condensed version of all of this because it's a book and it has to be. And the focus is really on these events that happened that were really awful. But I was thinking to myself, this is over a really long period of time. I'm thinking there probably are lots of days that feel like pretty great days, pretty normal, typical great days where this isn't happening. So was that the case where you were having, can you just describe what it was like in the days that weren't like this for people? In terms of.
I mean, this wasn't happening every day. It was happening frequently. And as the years went on, it was happening much more frequently. By the end, it was happening every day.
Sure.
This was my reality every day. But in the beginning, we would go months without an abusive incident, whether it was verbal or physical. And it was, I would say, what would be considered like a normal day in a normal household. You get the kids up, you go to work, come home, talk about your days, talk about the kids, do bedtime, have a little time together and go to bed. It was a normal functioning nuclear family, except when it wasn't.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is important in context for people because people hear the story, they hear those awful, horrific events and the incidents of abuse and just forget that in a lot of these relationships, there is also just a lot of normalcy that's happening. And so complicated. A question that I wanted to ask you that we haven't really covered yet is how do you know? So if you're in this and you're still in that place where you're thinking it's not bad enough yet, or, there are all these repercussions if I leave and I don't know if I can deal with those or face those right now. I'm afraid to leave. How do you know without a shadow of a doubt when it's time to go? What is it that you're looking for? And I guess we have to be careful with this because I suspect that you would say leave earlier.
Absolutely.
We're not saying wait until this moment. That's not what I'm trying to suggest. With the question. I'm just curious. And this is one of the questions that your publicist had sent to me, which, as one that you might want to discuss, which was just this question of how do you know when it's time to go? Because there were lots of times where you thought about it before this, that last kind of explosive incident.
Yeah. I mean, I can give the logical answer, which is, anytime your life is in danger, your children are in danger, you're concerned about anyone's well-being, you need to get out immediately. But really, it's different for every person.
Right.
Everybody has different moments. And when you wake up, it's like you come out of a daze and you're like, what is happening? For me, I was driving to work and it was right in the beginning of the Me Too movement in the United States. And they started talking about the term gaslighting. which had not been heard of. And they started explaining it and what it looks like and giving examples. And I had to pull over because I was crying because I was like, oh my God, this is what he's doing to me.
Yeah.
And then I started thinking about it. I'm like, that was physical abuse. Well, that time was physical abuse. That time definitely was physical abuse. And then I started thinking about, this is verbal abuse. And I woke up, I was like, oh my God, I'm in an abusive marriage. And that was, what do I do now? So I think that question is very complicated because I think it's different for everybody.
Yeah.
But as I said before, and I really want to like drive this point home, I've never met anybody who has been a domestic violence victim that has regretted leaving their abuser.
Right. Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. That's generally the case with everything bad.
Yeah.
Like I say that a lot in different contexts, like when
bad job,
like job, like habits, like something that's not serving you. And when you get to that point where it just feels so clear to you that it's taking more than it's giving, that it's not serving you, that it's not okay. Mm-hmm. I've never met anyone who's regretted leaving it. Yeah. And so I guess a lot of this comes down to trusting your own intuition, but unfortunately that gets screwed up by the gaslighting, by all of the chipping away. Right. So, wow. Well, Amanda, this has been such an interesting conversation. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you wanted to mention?
I can't think so. I can't think of anything. No.
Where can people find your book?
You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or my website, which is authораelee.com.
Perfect. And it's called One of the Lucky Ones.
Yep.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to be here today and for talking so honestly about this. I mean, one of the things that as I was reading the book, I just thought, man, this takes a lot of courage to write this book. And I am guessing that there were consequences for putting it down on paper and that it probably
knock on wood, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, good. I just meant like more, relationship wise, there are probably people who were not happy with the fact that you wrote it all down.
To be perfectly honest, I haven't heard a peep. So
interesting. Okay.
We are, we have defied the odds. We are amazing co-parents at this point.
That is so good to hear.
Don't have a protective order anymore. We communicate. We pretty much still stick to only communicating about the children unless, there's a grandparent or parent sick and then we're informing the other one. But no, we are actually amazing co-parents.
That is so great to hear. What do you think has made that possible? Like, can you pinpoint why? But because would you have thought that was possible?
No. And in fact, my psychic told me about the very first time I met with her that you guys are going to go to a really good place. You're going to be amazing co-parents. And I was like, you are insane. Yeah. There's no, you lost your mind, which I say to her all the time and she ends up being right. But I think, again, that night is a blessing because it forced him to get mental health help, which he needed. Yeah. So he has been on medication. He's going through therapy. He's gone to parenting classes. We did online parenting. I forget what her exact title was, but she was like a go-between between the two of us in the very beginning. And we worked really hard at putting what happened between us aside for the good of our children. Mm-hmm. And also my own work. I mean, I do have a psychic, but I also have worked really hard with a therapist and meditated and done all the things that I could think of for a trauma victim to try and get to a healthier place. Mm-hmm. So I think with both of us working as hard as we were individually, we have been able to come together and be parents to the children.
And I know you say, I think it's in the epilogue of the book, you say that you have forgiven him.
I have.
Yeah. And can you talk about that? Because I think there would be people listening thinking like, what? How do you get there? And like, talk about that and what the value in that has been for you.
Yeah. I have forgiven him, but just because I forgave him doesn't mean I've forgotten.
Right.
And there is a difference. The forgiveness was freeing for me. It's not for him. It's not like I called him up one day and was like, I just want you to know that I forgave you. Right. It was a freeing moment for me. I could either choose to hang on to this and not do all the work that I need to heal, because forgiveness is healing, or I could continue to heal and try and let this go. And that's what I really did. I did my best to forgive him. And you know, my parents read that and they were like, you forgave him? I'm like, it's just because I forgave him doesn't mean I'm making an excuse for what he did or forgot what he did.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that's really incredible. Well, thank you again, Amanda. And I wish you the best of luck with the book.
Thank you.
And I appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. Ready to create a life you don't want to escape from? Download your free Blueprint for Change now. This incredible workbook includes some of my favorite coaching tools and will help you get clear on what you need more and less of in your life. Grab it at www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint. That's www.wendymccallum.com/blueprint.